I've probably made every mistake that you can make as a CSO, starting and running 5 different programs. And I don't say that lightly. Some of them I've made 3 times in 3 different companies. In college, I used to sit by a lot of smart people, and that's kind of how I got through college, is I'd copy off their papers. But what I came out with is a degree in identifying and knowing the smartest people in the business. And that's what I do now. If I had known all the things I've learned in the last 15 years as part of the Security Executive Council, I would have been unbelievably more successful than I have in the last 30 doing this. We have added so much knowledge about successful security leaders and successful programs that we started what we call the Security Leadership Research Institute. We document that knowledge and we build on it. It's really why we created the SEC. What I'm going to do is take 30 minutes to cover some slides, and much of this material is on our website. You may not have seen it. Our website's getting very large. We're redoing it. But there's more information about each of these topics and how they can be applied and other things. But I will tell you that there is a lot of detail and research behind these. We're just going to be skimming the surface today in this 30 minutes on the things I really wish I had known. I'd like to call your attention to the fact that we don't sell silver bullets. The most common calls we get is, what is the best? What is this company doing? What's this person doing? I see how successful they're being. Can you send me a template? The real answer is that for whatever you're looking for, you have to go through a process to create success. And a success that'll work in your culture. I can give you something that company A is doing, but it doesn't mean that it's going to work in your company. We've written some articles on benchmarking, and there's a lot of value in benchmarking, but there's a lot of problems. You don't know if it works. You don't know if it'll work in your culture. You don't know if the person's telling you the truth. You don't know if he thinks it's successful, but his management doesn't. So I would encourage you to not look for these silver bullet answers. They very seldom give you the things you need to have a successful program or to be successful. The things I'm going to talk about require some very meaningful conversations between you, your leadership, the constituents, or your customers. I wish I had understood what the positions of different people were and the organization before I took jobs. But you know, when you're doing that, you're so busy getting the job, and as I said, I started 5 different programs, but I never really asked the right questions. I didn't have the meaningful conversations about what was going on in that company. And I'm the kind of guy that I'm kind of a half glass full kind of person, and I'd walk away from conversations and my expectations and optimism were more often than not exceedingly beyond the reality of what I was about to walk into. I was often picturing the ideal situation, and often I got there and it was far from what I had hoped it would be. In our industry, because we don't teach at many colleges and universities, business schools, and a lot of what we do is a product of personal opinion, a lot of people have different definitions of security. I never asked them what theirs was. We have people we work with right now that investigations is in HR or in legal. We have physical security that is in real estate. We have workplace violence is owned by HR. Insider threat is owned by IT, risk, legal, or compliance. At the end of the day, every organization has a different definition of what security is. I'm not positive that everybody sitting on this call can define what security is. You can define what it is, where you are now. At the end of the day, though, and we're often asked questions around this, that definition of security. What's the difference between corporate security and IT security? What's the difference between corporate security and just the guard force? Aren't you all just security officers? No, what corporate security does that sets us apart from everyone else is we are the malicious intent people. If someone has malicious intent to do damage to the company, that's our role. Whether they do it through cyber, a physical attack, a product contamination, whether they're a customer or whether they're an employee, we handle the malicious intent. And that's kind of my definition of what security is. We handle the malicious intent. This chart shows that in the early days, we were given all these areas. You handle physical security, investigations, access control, etc. Well, now it's very different than that. Security is a team sport. It's just another risk, and HR and legal and IT often play in this space. So we are really looking at a changing environment, not only of what security is, but who else is involved in it. I got into security as a punitive role. They didn't know what else to do with me, so they stuck me there. But now everybody wants to be in it. And so if you think about what business conduct and ethics does, well, they do a lot of investigations. IT does investigations, safety does investigations, audit does investigations, legal does investigations. Wait a minute, I thought I was in charge of investigations. Well, the truth is that there's 63 different kinds of investigations we've identified that publicly traded companies do, and as many as 13 different groups doing them. And the only real difference is the only group that generally has a background and training in it is corporate security. Now, I think we're the content experts, but it certainly doesn't mean we're the sole owners, and it doesn't mean that we fit into the definition of security that the company and our leaders have in place. And oh, by the way, if you get a new leader, they might have a completely different definition, so you might want to have that meaningful conversation early. Wish I had. I really wish I had known that what the company believed its most significant risks are. This slide says, what do you believe the company's most significant risks are? But the real issue is, what does the company believe they are? And as you go in and start a new job, are you going to sit down with the leadership team and talk about and come to agreement on what our risks are and the role security plays in addressing those risks? There's a product that we've developed called the Enterprise Security Risk Alignment. And you've all heard about enterprise security risk assessments, but how do you get those aligned to where you and senior leadership agree on what the risks are? Not only did I not sit around and work out the risks, I didn't ask them how we were going to do it. This was one of my biggest shocks, in that we have had a number of organizations come in. They've got a brand new security director. He writes a bunch of job descriptions, or she, and they're getting ready to hire people and build the large centralized staff. And we had one individual who actually turned in 3 different versions of that, and they said, we're not hiring any people. You can use contractors, but this was actually a company split. The company split in 2 parts. And they said, our model is that you're going to be the content expert. You're going to tell the business unit. You're going to write all the policy, the procedures. You're going to identify the vendors. You're going to tell everybody what they have to do. They're going to report this back to you. You're in charge of governance and oversight. And the sites and the business units do their own security. We call this a service delivery model. And what you see on the screen is 3 different service delivery models that we think are the most prevalent. And what sets separates them is the level of effort the security department does versus the business unit versus the contractors. And I have seen roles where there is one person for a $12 to $15 billion company. There's 25% of the Fortune 500 still doesn't have a security leader. They don't even think they need one. So the big question to you in looking at your new job is, am I going to be a doer? Or am I going to be, is that how I'm going to adjust to this? If it's an army of one, so I have to do all the investigations, I have to go out and do the site risk assessments, I have to coordinate the physical security upgrades, or are they going to have you doing governance and oversight? Very different skill sets and experience required for that. We have a lot of people that get into jobs and find out it wasn't the job they thought they were hiring onto because they had different ideas of how they were going to implement it. And by the way, who owns the risk? Another thing I wish I had known, I thought I owned security risks. Not true. I own security risk mitigation. Whoever the business leader is for that risk owns it. So for example, sales risk and theft, sales product theft, distribution theft, I don't own that risk. The head of distribution and sales owns that. What I need to know is how he wants to mitigate that. I'm the risk mitigator. The executives who have the authority and resources to pay to mitigate or accept a risk or sign off for a risk is who owns it. So if you've got $1 million risk to your supply chain or to your brand, who can give you $1 million or $200,000, whatever it's going to cost, to mitigate that risk? That's the risk owner. Security owns that mitigation, but it has to be aligned with their appetite. So what this chart shows are all the risks that come at a company, and those aren't walls, those are filters. And a risk mitigation strategy reduces the likelihood something bad's going to happen. Doesn't absolutely prevent it. If you really prevented every single risk from happening, they probably wouldn't be in business because nobody could get in, the systems would be shut down. And so each layer of mitigation takes out more risk. Now, what gets through the first filter is called the residual risk. Most executives don't know about a residual risk because a lot of security people go in and say, if you give me this money, I can prevent this. Well, no, you can't. So they, instead of saying, I can take us from 100% likelihood of occurrence to 80%. And the white space between the filters is the risk appetite of the executives and how many people are in that white space. How many people do you want in that white space? How much risk are you willing to take, and how tight do you want me to tighten this down? So if that's a sign at the property line, the first filter is a sign, a lot of people will turn away. If the second filter is a fence and a security officer, that's going to screen out a lot more, but you can still hide in a car, you can go around back, you can cut through the fence. How much risk do you want to take for your organization, and what's your risk appetite? And oh, by the way, how do we quantify that? I wish I'd known this. These are things I didn't know. I wish I had known that you have to align the mitigation strategies with the company. Not all companies need security officers. Not all companies need encryption in certain areas. Every corporation culture and risk is different. And so how do I align the risks with the appetites, with the budget, with the culture to my programs, services, and results? So every service I provide in security, why didn't I have that lined up to a risk? And I should be able to state what that risk is. and how much I'm going to be able to mitigate it. And so as you think of and how do you explain this to management, by the way? They know nothing about security. And of course, obviously, I obviously didn't either. But as you're having these meaningful discussions, and instead we go in and we say, we've got to have a workplace violence program. We've got to do this, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. Well, maybe, but first I have to know, do you think workplace violence is one of our most significant risks? Well, is it just to our employees, our salespeople? Is it just from the fact of the way we do business? Are we worried about other types of violence that could come into the workplace from strangers and disgruntled customers? We often try to sell a program before we have a customer that understands what his problem is. And back when I got into it, we used to kind of do the sky is falling. You either have to do this or you're going to die. And then they figured out they weren't going to die, and so then it was a little harder to sell the next one. And instead of having these meaningful conversations that produce really solid results and agreement, we sometimes just try and go sell a product that we learned about, like a workplace violence program. This is maybe one of the most important lessons that I've learned in the last 10 years for sure. I wish I had known how to run security like a business. I really wish I had understood that they expected me to be one of their business people who was an expert in security. And there were so many parts of this that I didn't understand. What we talked about before, how do you align programs and services to customers? Is every function in business in your company a customer? So what do you do for finance? What do you do for treasury? What do you do for real estate? What do you do for communications? What do you do for HR? What do you do for legal? What's your role with them? Do you only respond if they call? Is there risk that you should be lining them up with? If you were out as a business person and you had a security company, how would you approach your customers? What are you going to go in and sell them? First of all, you have to understand what they need, but then what are you going to provide as a service to them? I had an attorney call me one time and said, we really need help with our intellectual property program. I said, I can't even spell it. What could we possibly do to help you? Well, we need you to investigate trademark and trade name infringements. You can do investigations way cheaper than our law firms, and we want help in identifying these elements. I never thought of that, never even considered it. I thought about counterfeit product. I'd thought about diversion of product, but I hadn't thought about the trademark trade name person. So our customers, once we identify them, what's the cost of our service? What are we going to tell them that it's going to cost them if we're going to mitigate this, and can we do it by customer? And what's the value of the service we're going to provide? Can we market that to them? I couldn't. What's our capacity? What's our scalability? So what if all of, with one company I worked for, when I finally found out how many sites they had 800 U.S. locations. How am I going to scale to provide the same level of service to all those people? If I was going to go hire somebody to do all that, they'd certainly want to know, what's our service delivery model? How am I going to handle all of these sites? Do you want me to fly there? Do you want me to just call them on the phone? I wasn't running it like a business, thinking about a uniform service delivery model to all of these locations. Somebody once told me, they said, if you can't do it for everybody, don't do it for anybody. And that's when it started to dawn on me what scalability and capacity was about. What's our capacity? What's our excess capacity? So for your security officers, on an 8-hour shift, how much of their time is actively engaged in doing work, and how much of it is excess capacity where they could be doing other things? Are there other things you could be doing for the business that would enrich the job of the security officers, keep them more alert, wouldn't divert them from what their tasks are, but it would provide a much greater value to the business? We had one company we worked with. They created 16 new management jobs. 16 new management jobs by transferring what lower level things that these managers had been doing into the security force. Security people loved it, and it freed up 16 people's worth of time to tackle that. What's our cost of security? How much does it cost us to provide an hour of service, all in, administration, everything else, to our customers? What's our risk criticality scoring? What should I do first? What's regulatory required? What's required by contracts with people we do business with? What's culturally required? And what's the things we've been doing just because we do it forever? I worked for one company that the culture was you had to escort any employee to a car that wanted an escort. That had to be in your budget. That wasn't negotiable. Any more than one of their clients that mandated we have certain levels of physical protection to protect their product before we provide it to them. What's our cost of mitigation? Okay, we know what the cost of security is, but now can we accurately give a quote on what the cost of mitigation is going to be? What are our metrics? How are we going to communicate security value? How do we prove to management that they got their money's worth? What are the regulatory contractual standards that we have to provide? Have you reviewed all the laws, regulations, voluntary compliance programs that you're responsible for? Many of these laws and regulations that have come out, CTPAT, the federal sentencing guidelines, all of these have security elements in them. You know everything you have to do that's required by regulation or by standards that the company's utilizing. ISO standards, ANSI standards, other things that are there. Can you tell them what your regulatory baseline program looks like? Because those are things you have to do, as well as your contractual requirements. Those are all things that really go into a good security business. And when you're doing that with management, I think it really gives you a different approach. If they come to you with something they need done and you say, I don't have the capacity, I either have to hire people or I have to quit doing something. Which would you like me to do? That's running security like a business. I used to think if I just did everything they asked me, they'd think I was a team player. The truth was they thought I wasn't busy. I'll just keep giving him stuff. He doesn't seem to be all that busy with it. And so you want to run this like a business, just like sales and marketing and manufacturing does. This is an abbreviated process, and I wish I had known that I need a process to help me find the answers. Whether it's enterprise security risk alignment, the service delivery model that we talked about, what our roles and responsibilities are, how we measure risk and mitigation and residual risk, communicating the value proposition or the business case to management, effectively influencing your executives, the 5 stages of metrics from counting to operational excellence to business value to predictive and prescriptive metrics. You have to go through the process to effectively come up with the answer. There's not a template. There's not a silver bullet at the end of the story. It's the process you go through to come up with these answers, and I didn't know that. And the reason that we call this I wish I had known is I've learned so much in this last 15 years that I wouldn't want anybody to think I knew all that ahead of time. There's no place that this is being taught. We're the only people, I think, researching successful programs and leaders, and we're trying to share as much of it as possible. I learned through trial and error. I hope this has been something that has given you some food for thought, and that you're finding some useful resources in what we're talking about. We've listed some other resources that will take you to some of these things that I've just mentioned, from books we've written to articles we've written to research studies we've done. Our collaborative consulting page identifies all these problems different people call us with when they're kind of looking for a silver bullet, and that's on the left-hand side. And when you go to the right-hand side, it's the solution or the process we came up with solving that problem and how it can be done.